I can still hear the silence. Not the comfortable kind, not the kind that settles over a room when everyone is full and satisfied, and leaning back in their chairs with loosened belts and warm plates pushed forward. No, this was the other kind, the kind that drops like a hammer, the kind that sucks the oxygen out of a room so completely that you can hear the ice shifting in the pitcher of sweet tea on the counter, the kind that makes 12 people sitting around a dining table suddenly forget how to breathe. And all I'd done was ask one question. One simple, honest, carefully chosen question, aimed directly at the man sitting at the head of the table. My husband, Gerald, the man who 30 seconds earlier had tried to humiliate me in front of his entire family with a smile on his face and a joke in his voice, like cruelty, is acceptable as long as you deliver it with laughter. But I'll get to that moment. I promise you I will take you right to the center of it. But first I need you to understand who I was before that dinner, who Gerald was, what we looked like from the outside, and what we really were behind the door that no one else ever opened. My name is Patricia. Most people call me Pat, but Gerald always called me Patricia, the full name, every syllable, the way you say someone's name when you want them to feel the weight of it. At first I thought it was romantic. He'd say, "Patricia, come here," and something about the way the word moved through his mouth made me feel seen, formal, chosen. It took me years to realize that the way he said my name wasn't affection, it was authority. We met in 2009 at a church conference in Birmingham. I was 31, working as an office administrator for a pediatric clinic, living alone in a one-bedroom apartment with a cat named Bishop and a prayer life that kept me steady. I wasn't looking for a husband. I want to be clear about that. I was content, not perfectly happy, not lonely, just settled into a life that was mine and fit me like a well-worn coat. Gerald was the guest speaker's assistant at the conference. He handled logistics, microphones, schedules, seating arrangements, and he did it with a quiet competence that I found attractive. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with deep brown skin and a voice that carried across a room without ever rising. People listened when Gerald spoke, not because he shouted, but because he had a way of lowering his voice when he wanted your attention, drawing you in like a current pulling you beneath still water. He pursued me with intention. Sunday phone calls that lasted 2 hours, handwritten letters, actual letters on stationery with a fountain pen. He drove 4 hours round trip to take me to dinner on a Wednesday night because, as he said, "A woman like you deserves effort, not convenience." I fell in love with the effort. I married the man behind it without realizing they weren't the same thing. We married in 2010, a small ceremony at his family's church in Anniston. His mother, Vivian, sat in the front row in a lavender suit and watched me walk down the aisle with an expression I couldn't read. Not hostile, not warm, just assessing, like she was measuring me against a standard I hadn't been told about. Gerald's family was large and close. His mother was the center, Vivian Hayes, a retired school principal who ran her family the way she'd run her school, with structure, expectation, and an unspoken understanding that her approval was the currency that mattered most. Gerald had 2 brothers, Ray, the eldest, and Curtis, the youngest, and a sister, Denise, who lived in Atlanta and came home for every holiday, every birthday, every gathering that Vivian deemed important enough to require full attendance. And attendance was not optional. Every major holiday, every birthday, every anniversary, we gathered at Vivian's house. The long oak table in her dining room could seat 14, and it usually did. The meals were elaborate: roast beef, glazed ham, butter beans, macaroni and cheese baked in a dish so large it took 2 hands to carry. The family would sit and eat and talk, and Gerald would hold court at the end of the table nearest his mother, telling stories, making jokes, charming the room the way he always did. From the outside it looked like warmth, like tradition, like love. But I learned early that there were rules at that table, unspoken, unwritten, but absolute. You didn't disagree with Vivian. You didn't correct Gerald. You didn't bring up anything that disrupted the image of the family as strong, united, and above reproach. And you certainly, did not embarrass a Hayes man in his mother's house. I followed those rules for 13 years. I sat at that table and smiled. I complimented the food. I deferred to Gerald in conversation. I let his jokes land even when they were aimed at me, small jabs wrapped in charm, disguised as humor, delivered with a wink so that everyone laughed and I was expected to laugh along. Patricia's not much of a cook, but she tries. Laughter. You know Patricia, she's got opinions about everything, but don't worry, I keep her in line. Laughter. I told Patricia she should let me handle the finances. You know, women and math. Laughter. Each one a small cut, each one dressed up as a joke so that if I objected, I'd be the one who couldn't take it, the one who was too sensitive, the one who ruined the mood. I absorbed those cuts for over a decade. I smiled through every single one. And each time I told myself it didn't matter, that the laughter wasn't cruel, that Gerald didn't mean it, that this was just how families talked. But cuts don't stop being cuts just because you've learned to bleed quietly. And on Easter Sunday of last year, Gerald made a cut so deep, so public, so deliberate that the blood finally showed. The months leading up to that Easter dinner had been difficult in ways I hadn't fully admitted to myself. Gerald and I had been married for 13 years by then, and the shape of our marriage had changed the way a river changes its banks, slowly, invisibly, until one day you look up and realize the water is flowing somewhere completely different than where it started. In the beginning, Gerald had been attentive, present. He asked about my day. He touched the small of my back when we walked through parking lots. He noticed when I changed my hair or wore something new. But over the years, the attention thinned out like paint spread across too wide a canvas. The phone calls stopped. The letters, those beautiful handwritten letters, became a memory I sometimes doubted was real. And the man who had once driven 4 hours to take me to dinner on a Wednesday now sat across from me at our own kitchen table, scrolling through his phone, without looking up when I spoke. I tried to talk to him about it, more than once. I'd sit on the edge of the bed at night and say, "Gerald, I feel like we're drifting." And he'd sigh, not the kind of sigh that means I'm listening, but the kind that means you're being exhausting, and say, "Patricia, I work 60 hours a week. I come home, I provide, what more do you want from me? What more do you want from me?" As if love were a checklist, as if presents were the same as payroll. But the distance wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what filled the space between us when the closeness left. Gerald had developed a habit, and I call it a habit because calling it what it really was would have required me to face something I wasn't ready to face, of correcting me. In private and in public, small corrections at first, the way I loaded the dishwasher, the way I parked the car, the way I spoke to his mother on the phone, too casual, too familiar, not respectful enough. "Patricia, you don't call my mother by her first name, you call her Mrs. Hayes or ma'am." I'd been calling Vivian by her first name for 8 years. She'd never once objected. But Gerald decided it was wrong, so it became wrong, and I adjusted, the way I always adjusted, quietly, without argument, folding myself into whatever shape he required. Then the corrections became sharper, more frequent, more public. He started pointing out my mistakes in front of his family. Not in a loud, aggressive way. Gerald was never loud. That was part of what made it so effective. He delivered his criticisms the way a surgeon delivers a scalpel, with precision, with calm, with the steady hand of a man who knows exactly where to cut. At Thanksgiving, I brought a pecan pie to Vivian's house. I'd made it from scratch, my grandmother's recipe, the one she taught me when I was 14, standing in her kitchen with flour on my nose and sugar under my fingernails. I was proud of that pie. I set it on the dessert table and Gerald looked at it, shook his head slightly, and said in front of everyone, "Patricia, I told you to buy one from the bakery. You know your pie crust doesn't hold up." The table laughed. Vivian smiled. Denise said, "Oh, Gerald, leave her alone." But she said it the way people say stop when they don't really mean it, lightly, without weight, the way you wave away a fly but don't bother getting up to close the window. I smiled, I always smiled. And later that night, standing alone in my kitchen scraping the untouched pie into the garbage disposal, I felt something inside me harden. Not break, harden, like clay left in the sun too long, like soil that hasn't seen water in months. By February, the corrections had become a constant undercurrent. He criticized the way I dressed. "That skirt is too tight for a woman your age, Patricia." He criticized my friendships. "You spend too much time on the phone with Wanda. She's a gossip and it reflects on me." He criticized my ambition. I'd mentioned going back to school, maybe finishing the degree I'd put on hold when we got married, and he'd looked at me like I'd suggested flying to the moon. "Patricia, you're 44 years old. Who goes back to school at 44? Focus on what's in front of you." What's in front of me? As if what was in front of me was enough. As if the life he'd built around me, small, contained, carefully managed, was supposed to be the whole world. I stopped bringing it up. I stopped bringing up a lot of things. I learned which conversations were safe and which ones led to the sigh, the headshake, the quiet dismissal that somehow felt louder than yelling. And then in early March, something happened that changed the trajectory of everything. I received a letter from the community college downtown. I had applied months earlier, quietly, without telling Gerald, using my personal email and my maiden name on the application. It was an acceptance letter, a seat in the fall cohort for the business administration program, a chance to finish what I'd started 15 years ago. I held that letter in my hand standing by the mailbox, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I felt the flutter of a life that was mine, not Gerald's, not Vivian's, not the family's, mine. I hid the letter in the bottom of my jewelry box beneath the velvet lining, where Gerald would never look. And I carried the secret of it with me like a small flame cupped between my palms, fragile, warm and mine alone. I didn't know then that Gerald was carrying a secret too, one far less innocent, one that would come spilling out at his mother's Easter table in the ugliest way I could have imagined. Not because he confessed it, but because he tried to weaponize mine first. Easter Sunday arrived the way it always did in the Hayes family, with expectation. Vivian called Gerald on Saturday night to confirm the menu, the seating, the arrival time. I could hear her voice through the phone from across the bedroom, clipped, efficient, the voice of a woman who had never in her life wondered whether she was in charge. Gerald sat on the edge of the bed and said, "Yes, ma'am," 4 times, then hung up and told me we needed to be there by 1 o'clock sharp. "Wear the blue dress," he added, not looking at me, "the one with the sleeves, Mama likes that one." I almost said something, almost asked him when I'd lost the right to choose my own clothes, but the words caught somewhere between my chest and my throat, the way they always did when the cost of speaking felt higher than the cost of silence. I wore the blue dress. We arrived at Vivian's house at 12:55. The azaleas along her front walkway were in full bloom, bright fuchsia and white, perfectly trimmed, the kind of beauty that requires constant, unforgiving maintenance. The house itself was a brick colonial with green shutters and a front door that was always unlocked on gathering days. Inside, it smelled like brown sugar ham and fresh rolls and the faint, sharp scent of pine sol beneath everything, because Vivian's house was always clean, always presentable, always ready for inspection. The family was already assembling. Ray and his wife, Claudette, were in the kitchen helping Vivian plate the food. Curtis was in the living room with his girlfriend, Maya, watching basketball with the volume low. Denise had arrived from Atlanta with her 2 teenagers, who immediately disappeared upstairs to avoid adult conversation. Gerald's uncle Floyd was sitting in the recliner by the window, nursing a glass of something amber and nodding at whoever passed. I greeted everyone the way I always did, with warmth, with hugs, with the practiced ease of a woman who had spent 13 years learning the choreography of this family. I complimented Vivian's table setting. I helped Claudette arrange the serving spoons. I poured sweet tea into glasses and carried them to the dining room on a tray, careful not to spill, careful not to take up too much space, careful in all the ways I had been trained to be careful. Gerald moved through the house differently than I did. He moved like he owned it because in a sense he did. He was Vivian's middle son, her favorite, though she would never say it aloud. He inherited her authority the way some children inherit eye color, naturally, completely, without effort. He shook hands with his brothers, kissed his mother's cheek, and settled into his chair at the head of the table like a man lowering himself onto a throne. By 1:30 we were seated, 14 of us around the long oak table. The ham was glazed and glistening. The mac and cheese was golden on top, bubbling at the edges. The rolls were warm in a basket lined with a cloth napkin. Vivian said grace, long, formal, her voice steady as a metronome, and when she said Amen, the table exhaled and began to eat. For the first 20 minutes everything was fine, normal. The conversation moved around the table like a lazy river, work, weather, someone's car trouble, Denise's son making the honor roll. I ate quietly, offering a comment here and there, laughing at the right moments, performing the role I had rehearsed for over a decade. And then Gerald set his fork down. I noticed it because of the way he did it, deliberately, the metal clicking against the plate like a judge's gavel. He leaned back in his chair, wiped his mouth with his napkin, and looked around the table with that particular expression I had come to dread. The half-smile, the slightly raised chin, the look of a man who is about to say something he finds amusing and expects the room to agree. "You know," he began, his voice carrying that low, magnetic quality that always commanded attention, "I found something interesting this week." The table quieted, Not completely. Curtis was still chewing, Claudette was reaching for the salt, but the energy shifted. People looked up. Gerald had the room. I was looking for my watch, the one with the leather band, and I thought maybe Patricia had put it in her jewelry box. He glanced at me, the half-smile widened, so I opened it up, and guess what I found? My stomach dropped, not slowly, instantly, like an elevator with a cut cable. I felt the blood leave my face, my fingers tightened around my fork. He reached into his jacket pocket, his Easter jacket, the charcoal grey one, and pulled out a folded piece of paper. I recognized it immediately. The acceptance letter, my acceptance letter, the one I had hidden beneath the velvet lining of my jewelry box like a treasure, like a prayer. He unfolded it slowly, theatrically, holding it up so the table could see the letterhead. Patricia, he said, his voice dripping with amusement, has apparently applied to community college. He let the words land, let them sit in the air like smoke. And then he laughed, not a cruel laugh, not on the surface, a warm, generous, isn't this adorable laugh, the kind of laugh that invites everyone else to laugh along because surely this is funny, surely this is harmless, surely no one would take this seriously. 44 years old, he said, shaking his head. Going back to school, can you imagine? Ray chuckled. Claudette looked down at her plate. Denise shifted in her chair. Vivian's expression didn't change, but her eyes moved to me, and in them I saw something I hadn't expected. Not sympathy, curiosity, the look of a woman watching to see what the mouse does when it realizes the trap has closed. Uncle Floyd sipped his drink and said nothing. Gerald looked at me, still smiling, still performing. I told her, Patricia, focus on what's in front of you, but you know how she is, always got some idea. The table waited, for me to laugh, to wave it off, to play my part the way I always had, smile, absorb, deflect, survive. But something had shifted inside me, something had finally, irreversibly broken free. I set my fork down, I folded my hands in my lap, and I looked at Gerald with an expression he had never seen on my face before because I had never worn it before. Not in 13 years of marriage, not once. It was calm, it was steady, and it was done. The table was watching me. 14 people, forks suspended, glasses half raised, every pair of eyes waiting to see what Patricia would do, what she always did, smile, laugh, shrink. But the woman sitting in that chair was not the same woman who had walked through Vivian's front door an hour ago. Something had snapped, not broken, snapped, like a bone resetting itself after years of healing wrong. And for the first time in my marriage, I felt the full weight of my own voice sitting in my chest, ready to be used. I didn't raise it, I didn't need to. Gerald, I said, quiet, steady, the way you speak when you want every syllable to land. Since we're sharing things we found this week, can I share something too? His smile faltered, just barely, a flicker behind the eyes like a candle in a draught. He didn't say yes, he didn't say no. He just looked at me the way a man looks at a door that's always been locked when he suddenly hears the knob turning from the other side. Go ahead, he said, but his voice had lost its warmth, the performance was cracking. I reached into the small handbag I'd hung on the back of my chair, the one I'd packed that morning with the same deliberateness a soldier packs a field kit. I pulled out my phone. I'd taken photographs, 3 of them, screenshots saved in a folder I'd created 2 weeks ago, the night I finally stopped pretending. Because here's what Gerald didn't know, here's what no one at that table knew. 3 weeks before Easter, I had come home early from work on a Friday afternoon. The clinic had closed early for a staff training day, and I'd decided to surprise Gerald with dinner, something nice, maybe the lemon chicken he liked, maybe candles on the table, maybe an attempt to reach across the distance that had grown so wide between us I could barely see him on the other side. I pulled into the driveway and noticed his truck was already there. He wasn't supposed to be home until 6, but there it was, parked at an angle, the way he parked when he was in a hurry. I walked inside quietly, not sneaking, just quiet, the way I naturally moved through the house. The living room was empty, the kitchen was untouched, but from the hallway I heard his voice. Low, soft, coming from behind the closed door of the spare bedroom, the room we used as an office, the room where I paid bills and filed paperwork, and once, a long time ago, had imagined would become a nursery. I stood outside that door and I listened, and what I heard was not a phone call about work. It was not a conversation with his brother or his mother or his friend. It was a man talking to a woman in the voice he used to use with me, intimate, tender, unhurried, saying things that didn't belong to me anymore. I miss you too. No, she doesn't know. I'll figure it out, I promise. You know you're the one I want to talk to. I stood there for 45 seconds, maybe a minute, long enough for my heart to break and then, strangely, to go still. The way a lake goes still after a stone has sunk to the bottom and the ripples have finished their work. I didn't open the door, I didn't gasp, I didn't cry. I turned around, walked back to my car and drove to the parking lot of a Kroger 3 miles away. I sat in the driver's seat with the engine off and my hands on the wheel, and I thought about every joke he'd made at my expense, every correction, every small, careful act of diminishment that I had swallowed like medicine I'd been told was good for me. And I realized something that changed everything. Gerald didn't belittle me because I was small. He belittled me because he needed me to stay small. Because a woman who believes she is foolish will never think to look for the truth. A woman who has been taught that her ideas are silly, her ambitions are laughable, her instincts are wrong, that woman will stand in her own house and hear her husband whispering to another woman and tell herself she must be imagining it. But I wasn't imagining it, and I was done being small. Over the next 2 weeks I gathered what I needed, not for a courtroom, not yet, for myself. I checked the phone records through our shared account. I found the number, calls lasting 30, 40, 50 minutes, sometimes twice a day, always during work hours, always when I was at the clinic. I searched the number online and found a name, Keisha Moore, a woman from Gerald's office, 36 years old. I found her social media, private, but her profile photo showed a woman with kind eyes and box braids, and for a moment I felt something unexpected, not hatred but sadness, because she probably didn't know the full story either. Or maybe she did and had told herself the same lies we all tell ourselves when we want something that belongs to someone else. I took screenshots of the call logs, I saved them on my phone, I put them in a folder, and I waited. Because I knew Gerald, I knew his pride, I knew that sooner or later he would do what he always did, he would try to make me feel small in front of the people whose approval mattered most to him. And when that moment came, I would be ready. Easter Sunday, his mother's table, the acceptance letter held up like a trophy of my foolishness. That moment had come. I looked at Gerald, the table was still silent, my phone was in my hand. I just have one question, I said. My voice was calm, almost gentle, the way you speak to someone when you already know the answer and you're giving them one last chance to tell the truth. Who is Keisha Moore? The silence that followed was unlike anything I have ever experienced. It wasn't empty. It was full of the weight of a name that should never have existed in our marriage, hanging in the air above Vivian's Easter table like a crack, spreading across a ceiling that everyone had believed was solid. Gerald's face went through 3 expressions in the span of 2 seconds. The first was confusion, manufactured, deliberate, the kind a man puts on when he's buying time. The second was recognition, the flash behind his eyes that told me he knew exactly who Keisha Moore was. And the third, the one that settled and stayed, was fear. Real fear, the kind that lives in the chest of a man who has spent years constructing an image and suddenly realizes someone has found the seam. What? He said just that, one word, but his voice had changed. The authority was gone, the magnetism was gone. What came out was thin and hollow like a bell that's been cracked. Keisha Moore, I repeated. I didn't look away from him. I didn't blink. The woman you've been calling twice a day from the office. The woman you talk to for 45 minutes while I'm at work. The woman you were whispering to in our spare bedroom 3 weeks ago on a Friday afternoon when you thought I wasn't home. The table didn't move. No one reached for a glass. No one shifted in their chair. It was as if the room itself had inhaled and was holding its breath. Ray put his fork down slowly. Claudette's hand moved to her mouth. Curtis leaned forward, his brow furrowed, like a man trying to hear something he wasn't sure he'd heard correctly. Denise's teenagers, who had come downstairs for dessert, stood frozen in the doorway. And Vivian sat at the other end of the table with her hands folded in front of her plate, and for the first time in 13 years I saw something shift in her expression. The composure was still there. It would take more than this to crack Vivian Hayes, but beneath it something moved. A tightening around her mouth, a slight narrowing of her eyes, the look of a woman whose cathedral had just developed a fracture she hadn't approved. Gerald opened his mouth, closed it. His hands were flat on the table, the way a man braces himself against an earthquake. Patricia, he said, and there it was, my full name, every syllable, but this time it didn't carry authority. It carried desperation. This is not the time or the place. No, I said. I kept my voice low, almost soft. This table was the right time and place to hold up my acceptance letter and laugh at me in front of your entire family. This table was the right time and place to call me foolish for wanting to go back to school, but it's not the right time and place for this. I set my phone on the table. The screen was facing up, showing the call log, the highlighted number, the duration of calls, the dates. Weeks of evidence glowing softly against the white tablecloth. 47 minutes on March 3rd, I said. 39 minutes on March 7th. 52 minutes on March 14th. 2 calls on March 19th, 1 in the morning, 1 at lunch. I looked up at him. Should I keep going because there are more, many more? Gerald's jaw tightened. A muscle in his cheek twitched, a small, involuntary movement that I had never seen before. The mask was slipping, and beneath it was a man I didn't recognize. Not because he was different from the man I'd married, but because he was exactly the same, and I was finally seeing him clearly. You went through my phone records, he said, and there it was, the pivot, the redirect, the classic maneuver of a man caught in the wrong who immediately tries to put you on trial instead. Make the accuser the accused, shift the focus from what he did to how you found out. I went through our shared account, I said, the one with both our names on it, the one you told me to manage because what was it you said? Women are better with the details. I paused. You were right about that, Gerald. I'm very good with the details. Uncle Floyd set his glass down on the side table. The clink of it was the only sound in the room. Gerald, Vivian's voice cut through the silence like a blade wrapped in velvet. She didn't raise it. She didn't need to. Is what Patricia is saying true? He looked at his mother, and in that look I saw something I had waited 13 years to see. I saw Gerald Hayes, the man who commanded every room, who corrected every mistake, who made every person around him feel slightly smaller so that he could feel slightly larger. I saw him shrink. Mama, it's not, it's complicated. I didn't ask if it was complicated, Vivian said. Her voice was ice and iron. I asked if it was true. The silence returned, heavier this time, pressing down on the table like a hand on a chest. Gerald looked down at his plate. The ham was cold. The rolls had gone stiff. The candles Vivian had placed in the center of the table flickered once, as if even the flames were holding their breath. Yes, ma'am, he said, barely above a whisper. It's true. Claudette closed her eyes. Ray leaned back in his chair and rubbed his hand across his face. Curtis shook his head slowly, the way you do when someone confirms something you hoped you'd misheard. Denise put her arm around her daughter, who was standing in the doorway with wide eyes, watching the family portrait crack from corner to corner. And I sat very still. My hands were in my lap, my back was straight, my eyes were dry. Because I had already cried, weeks ago in a Kroger parking lot with the engine off and my hands on the wheel. I had done my braking in private, the way women like me always do, quietly, invisibly in spaces where no one can see us fall apart. And by the time I sat down at that Easter table, I had nothing left to break. Only truth left to speak. I picked up my acceptance letter from where Gerald had set it on the table. I folded it carefully once, twice, and slipped it back into my handbag. I'm going to finish my degree, I said, not to Gerald, not to Vivian, to the room, to the air, to myself, and I won't be apologizing for it. I pushed my chair back from the table and stood up. And no one tried to stop me. I drove home alone that evening. The sun was setting behind the pine trees along Highway 431, turning the sky into layers of amber and violet, and I drove with the windows down because I needed to feel something real on my skin. The wind was cool and smelled like cut grass and red clay, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt like I could breathe without measuring how much air I was allowed to take. Gerald didn't follow me. I didn't expect him to. A man like Gerald doesn't chase, he regroups. He strategizes. He waits for the dust to settle so he can begin reshaping the narrative. I knew that by morning he'd have a version of the story ready, one where he was the victim of an emotional wife who ambushed him at his mother's table, who aired private business in front of the family, who humiliated him when all he'd done was make a harmless joke. But the truth was already out, and truth once spoken at a table with 14 witnesses doesn't bend to fit a new frame, not even for Gerald Hayes. He came home around 10 o'clock that night. I was sitting on the couch in the living room, still in the blue dress, a cup of chamomile tea on the side table going cold. He walked in and stood in the hallway, his jacket over his arm, his face drawn and tired in a way I had never seen before. He looked older, smaller, like a man who had finally been measured and come up short. "We need to talk," he said. "Yes," I said, "we do." He sat in the armchair across from me, not next to me, not close, and he talked. For the first time in our marriage, Gerald talked without performing, without managing, without calibrating every word for maximum effect. He told me about Keisha, that it started 6 months ago, that she was a project coordinator at his office, that it began as conversations over lunch and became something else, something he said he hadn't planned, hadn't intended, hadn't meant to let go so far. I listened, I let him finish, and when he was done I asked him one more question, the last question I would ever ask him as his wife. "Gerald, when you held up that letter tonight, when you laughed at me in front of your family for wanting to go back to school, did you do that because you thought it was funny? Or did you do it because you needed me to stay small enough to never find out?" He didn't answer. He just sat there, his hands clasped between his knees, staring at the carpet, and his silence was the most honest thing he had given me in years. I filed for divorce in May. The process was not quick and it was not painless. Gerald contested at first, not because he wanted the marriage, but because he wanted control of how it ended. He wanted mediation, private settlement, no public record of fault. He wanted the story to be mutual, amicable, two people who grew apart. But I was done letting him write my story. My attorney was a woman named Brenda Caldwell, short, sharp, with reading glasses she wore on a chain around her neck, and a voice like gravel wrapped in silk. She looked at the call records, the timeline, the pattern of financial decisions Gerald had made without my knowledge, including a personal credit card I'd never seen with charges that told their own story, and she said, "Patricia, you're going to be fine. Better than fine." The divorce was finalized in September. I kept the house, I kept my dignity, and I kept the acceptance letter, now framed, hanging on the wall of the spare bedroom that I had converted into a study. I started classes in October, business administration, Tuesday and Thursday evenings in a classroom with fluorescent lights and plastic chairs and 23 other students, half of them younger than my marriage had been. The first night I sat in the front row with a notebook and a pen, and when the professor asked us to introduce ourselves and say why we were there, I stood up and said, "My name is Patricia, I'm 44 years old. And I'm here because I finally stopped letting someone else decide what I'm capable of." The girl next to me, couldn't have been more than 20, looked at me and whispered, "That's the coolest thing I've ever heard." I smiled, a real smile, the kind that starts in your chest and reaches your eyes before it ever touches your mouth. Vivian called me once, about 3 months after the divorce was final. I was sitting on my front porch, my porch now, my rocking chair, my rosemary plant that I'd bought to replace the emptiness where Gerald's used to be, and her name appeared on my phone screen. I almost didn't answer, but something in me, the part that still respected the woman, even if I'd outgrown the fear of her, made me pick up. "Patricia," she said, her voice was measured, careful, but underneath it there was something I hadn't heard from her before, something that sounded almost like respect. "I want you to know," she said, "that what Gerald did was wrong, and what he did at my table, using my home to embarrass you, that was unforgivable." She paused, I could hear her breathing through the phone. "You handled yourself with more grace than he deserved, and I should have said that sooner." I closed my eyes. The evening air moved across the porch, warm and sweet, carrying the scent of marigolds from the flower bed I'd planted in the spring. "Thank you, Vivian," I said, and I meant it, not because I needed her approval, but because hearing it reminded me of something I had almost forgotten, that dignity once reclaimed is visible, even to the people who watched you lose it. "I want to be honest with you. Healing is not a straight line. There are mornings I wake up and reach for a version of my life that no longer exists. There are evenings I sit at my kitchen table alone and feel the silence press against me like a living thing. There are moments, small, unexpected. Ambush moments, when I hear a man laugh a certain way in a grocery store, or catch the scent of a cologne that reminds me of Gerald, and the old ache returns like a tide I thought had gone out for good. But I am no longer small. That is the difference. I am no longer arranged, no longer managed, no longer the woman who smiles through cuts and calls it love. I am Patricia. I am 45 years old. I am finishing my degree. I am sleeping in the center of my own bed in the center of my own life, and I am not apologizing for taking up space. If you are sitting somewhere right now, listening to this, reading this, feeling this in your chest, and you recognize something in my story, I want you to hear me. Not as advice, not as instruction, just as one woman speaking to another across the distance. You are not too old, you are not too foolish, you are not too much, and the person who needs you to believe that you are the person who holds your dreams up at the dinner table and laughs, that person is not protecting you. They are protecting themselves from the version of you that doesn't need them anymore. Let that version live, she's been waiting. Now I want to ask you something, and I want you to sit with it before you answer. If you were at that table, if someone you loved held up your private dream and made it a joke in front of everyone, what would your one question have been? Would you have asked it? Or would you have smiled and swallowed it the way so many of us have been taught to do? Tell me in the comments. I'm listening, I'm always listening. And if this story gave you something, courage, comfort, or just the feeling of being understood, share it with someone who needs it. Subscribe if you haven't, come back next time. There's always room at this table. But tonight this was Patricia's story, and she's glad she finally told it. Take care of yourselves, I'll see you in the next one.